You're tuning into Vantage Point. My name is Cynthia Ng, and on this episode, we will be discussing on the topic of climate and energy. And I have two panelists on set today. Firstly, on my far left, we have Dr. Hezri Adnan. He is a senior fellow at ISIS Malaysia. And next to him, next to me, we have Dr. Benjamin Sovacool. He is the founding director of the Energy Security and Justice Program at the Vermont Law School in the United States, who is here in Malaysia to deliver a public lecture. So thank you so much to both of you for coming on the show. Now, when we talk about climate and energy, there are few things that we are very certain. Firstly, demand for energy is only going to go up. And with this increasing demand for energy, we are using more resources and we're depleting it at a very unhealthy rate, I would say. And finally, these issues are so complex, but at the same time, they are interrelated, interdependent. For example, if you want to talk about climate, we can't escape from talking about water or food production and how much water is used for food production, and from the food production, how much carbon footprints, carbon dioxide is released into the air by producing food. So maybe I can start from there. Dr. Benjamin, could you just elaborate more on this interrelatedness and how is this contributing to the climate change that we're experiencing?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it's something that we forget, which is that this issue of energy, water, climate change, food is economy-wide. And so you can have entire economies that become quite good at belching carbon dioxide into the air. And unfortunately for Malaysia, it's one of the top 20 countries in the world for actually emissions of greenhouse gases. And if you look at the growth rates, as in who's growing the fastest at emitting greenhouse gases, Malaysia is number 2. So second fastest
big
grower.
Contributing lot.
Right? And if you look at the sources of those emissions, they're spread across all sorts of sectors: electricity, food, transport, water, land use, agriculture. All of it is together. And so you're spot on that this issue is kind of one of a nexus. It's so interrelated that you have to kind of change the entire structure of the Malaysian economy if you're going to do anything about it.
But often all this decision-making, of this interrelatedness of energy, food and security, it happens at the policy level. And we look at, let's say you want to tackle a water issue, we go to the water department, or a land issue, we go to the agricultural department, the ministry. So in that sense, how perhaps Dr. Hezri could elaborate in the Malaysia context, do we have that nexus, like you mentioned, mentality or perspective at the moment?
Yeah, I think thank you very much for inviting us to this program. Silo, I think you're referring to a phenomenon called silo. You're managing within your own fragmented agencies and ministries, and all supposed to look at same issue but with different lens. So a couple of days ago, we organized an international conference on regional energy governance and the Nexus perspective. Nexus means interconnection or linkages. Of course, the word is maybe a bit strange to some people, but in the past 6 months, in 1 year, there's been a lot of international attention on the issue of nexus, particularly after the food crisis, the financial crisis. People are starting to rebuild the economy and referring to words like green economy and green growth. We're trying to build the interconnection between food, energy, and water security. It's already been there for a long time, but this time around, I think there's more international attention on these issues. And on the domestic front, I think that's why we're bringing this issue to Kuala Lumpur this time around. We need to have more interaction on this topic because we are so used to managing things in silos.
Dr. Benjamin, you have worked across more than 50 countries in Africa, in Asia, in everywhere part of the world. So you're an expert in all kinds of energy. So maybe you talk about what Dr. Hezri has mentioned at the international level. We have summits like Rio +20 and things like that, but often we see what happens at this conference are a lot of talking and bickerings about which country is producing more carbon dioxide and which country should be paying more, or carbon credit which did not really took off until now. So maybe what is happening at the moment at that?
Unfortunately, not much or not enough. And that's not surprising for those of us like Dr. Hezri and myself who kind of study political science. You shouldn't expect much because one of the things that you have when you get to the international level is called the diffusion of responsibility. You have so many countries involved, and all of them are responsible to some degree. Nobody wants to take a leadership role. And this is often illustrated with a problem of psychology. Some people will be driving on a highway and will see a hitchhiker, but they won't pick up the hitchhiker because they think somebody else will. But in the end, nobody picks up the hitchhiker. Or if you hear somebody crying for help when they're drowning in a swimming pool, everyone else will say, well, I could get wet, but I think they should do it. And in the end, no one does anything because they're waiting for everyone else to act. And at the international level, that's exactly what's happening with climate change. The US doesn't want to go first unless China will do something. China doesn't want to go first unless the US does something. So we have had 20 years, Rio plus 20, of doing kind of very little. And I think that the key point to take away from that is we shouldn't be surprised that we get so little out of these international agreements. We shouldn't raise our expectations to expect them to solve all of our problems. What we should instead do is take our own personal responsibility, how each of us can touch the food, energy, climate, water nexus with everything we do throughout our daily lives and routines.
You're saying that we should not wait for policy to implement initiatives. So from that point, as an individual, as if like myself, how would you propose, people to start even want to listen to green economy and things that are deemed a little unsexy if compared to other entertainments and things that we have out there? So, based on your research so far, I think you have come up with some findings how actually we can approach that.
Two very simple things. And so if you rejigger some of the statistics a little bit, it turns out that about 70% of emissions are from two things that every human being does. All those emissions are directly under our control, related to two sectors: mobility and transportation, how we get from place to place, and electricity in the home, what we use in our home, appliances, iPads, air conditioning, etc. So in the first one of transportation, it's simple things. It's like taking mass transit instead of owning a car, or if you do own a car, buy one that's fuel efficient, or maybe walk just a little bit more. And you'll cut your footprint 10, 20% and save fuel costs, petrol costs. For electricity, it's simple things like maybe turning the air conditioner temperature up so it's not so low, maybe sleeping with a fan, maybe it's washing your clothes in cold water instead of hot water, and again, it saves up to 10, 20%. And there are many other examples. In terms of what we eat, what we choose to drink. Bottled water is a horrible idea because you need about 9 times as much water to make the bottle that's actually inside the bottle.
You see, these are the things that people do not realize. A simple thing like washing your clothes in cold water instead of warm water. And I have to take this discussion to the first commercial break, but maybe when we get back, Dr. Hezri could point things out on the local front, what is happening in terms of creating that awareness, that initiative to actually take action individually instead of waiting for the government to say, hey, you should do this. We'll go for the first commercial break. We'll be back shortly. Stay with us. Hi, Vantage Point, and we are on the topic of climate and energy, and particularly on the Nexus perspective. What is Nexus? It's the interrelatedness of energy, food and water, and often we do not realize this. Earlier during the discussion, we're talking about how can you get individuals to champion this perspective, to start from home, like simple things as turning off your air conditioning. So I'd like to go to Dr. Hezri. We see that there are a lot of different stakeholders when it comes to climate change. We have the business people, we have layman people like myself, and we also have the governance level. So maybe you can take it from there. How can you make it more applicable, let's say from the business perspective, because we know that green, environmental friendly products does always go hand in hand with profit making. So maybe you can take the discussion from there.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. I think we have to take a long-term view on this thing. I think if in the 70s and 80s, probably it's much more difficult to talk about the green products and green technology. But now in 2012, it's more acceptable even to the business sector. And if you look at even the international discussion in Rio de Janeiro a few months ago, you got about 750 commitments from business leaders, the top business leaders from around the world, despite of the lack of commitment from some governments to agree with each other. So that is, I think, a welcoming fact. And I think in the forthcoming years, due to the recognition that climate change is real, an issue of nexus, and are beginning to affect business practices and affect us in a real way, then you begin to have a real direction from business sector as well. On the individual side, I think there's a lot of more of energy or climate or sustainability literacy program that needs to be put in place. In a small way, it has happened in many parts of the world. In fact, in Malaysia, even a number of universities have started looking into sustainability courses as elective courses or as elective as compulsory one. So I think it's beginning to happen in a small way. So I think this is where government needs to come in and say, look, we need to do a bit more on this.
On the government level also, for I think one of your articles you mentioned about, yes, perhaps the government, federal government would like to, is very keen to protect our land, biodiversity, but very often when it comes to issues like land or mining or agriculture, is under the state jurisdiction. So then there is the problem of, okay, who gets to say what and do what. So at the international level as well, maybe Dr. Benjamin or Dr. Hezri could add on to that.
Well, definitely, because we are structured as a federal system. You know, you have the federal government who sets the overarching policies and objectives and economic development, and the state government has got to respond to this higher level objective to operationalize.
So do you see perhaps a better mechanism to?
Land use would be a great challenge in years to come, because unlike 20, 30 years ago, in fact, if you take the example of our forests, they're not, in fact, not as much as it used to be. So now we are thinking of programs like Central Forest Spine to connect all these fragmented forests together, and this will require a new way of looking at land use and how we execute land use at the state level. There are some mechanisms that can be put in place. For instance, you can buy up or lease some of these important or environmentally sensitive areas that reside on state government territory, and get the private sector to pay for it, for instance. Yeah.
I can just add on that.
Yes,
I completely
please.
agree, and I think I'm reminded by a dead German philosopher whose name was Habermas.
Okay.
He once said, in the process of enlightenment, there can only be participants. We all have to contribute at all levels. I was talking earlier about what we could do as individuals to kind of be more sustainable, et cetera. But there's a role to play for all of us. The private sector has a role where they can make money. The government has a role where they can promote the public good. Consumers have a role where they can create better lifestyles. Civil society has a role to make sure that we follow the rules. Right? So we all have parts to play. We can't do it alone. It's a process that will require the participation of every single level of government that we have and governance that we have, because the problem is at that level.
Which sector do you think would drive this transformation first?
I would hope it would be consumers and individuals, but I suspect that we're too fragmented and we're too decentralized and individualistic to do that. One person would love to buy a hybrid vehicle, the other wants an SUV. That's just how they are. So I suspect if I had to pick, I would say either government should go and steer the way, or the private sector.
And
either
how,
of those two.
when you talk about private sector, how do you get the buy-in to invest in green technology and stuff? Because firstly, this costs a lot of money, and the returns will probably appear in 20 years down the road, maybe. I'm not sure. You have to enlighten me on that.
Well, I think we can both answer that question, but the trick is that there's good money to be made in green technology, and one of the easiest ways is that energy efficiency. All the things that you would do to become more efficient, and usually to cut carbon and save water, are things that these companies should be doing anyway to make money, and they can make money very quickly. Now the question is, why aren't they doing them if they can make money doing them?
Yeah.
Because they can make more money doing other things, or because there are just transaction costs, split incentives, lack of information, all these things that hobble all of us in the decisions that we make. But there is at least $20 to $25 trillion worth of energy efficiency investments that all the world could make in the next 20 years that would make money and accomplish all of these goals at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with you that it has to make business sense first before anything else, right? And I think that there is that recognition, I think, among the business sector. Of course, it varies between countries and between sectors. Perhaps
how about in Malaysia? How do you see the growth of perhaps renewable energy? Because we have introduced the feed-in tariff, and how is it progressing right now? And what does it take to really push it forward?
Well, there has been some improvement over the years, of course. For instance, we have this company, we were talking about this morning, that they benefited a lot from a Surya 1000 program, which we initiated about 10 years ago. So I think the business sector, the financing sector has got to respond positively to some of the responses that government had put in place. For instance, the Green Technology Financing Scheme, 1.5 billion, and with government guarantee, it has spearheaded a number of good green technology companies in Malaysia.
No, I would also agree, and I think that Malaysia's done a nice job with its feed-in tariff, although if there was one small problem with it, is it uses a quota system where it limits, it caps the number of people that can participate. And that does make sense because you don't want it to cost so much money. But at the same time, there tends to be much more potential that could be tapped if you were to get rid of those limitations. And so I think that's one easy way, that if the government were to up the quotas they would probably increase the penetration of renewables quite quickly.
Okay, I'll have to cut you short and go for the next commercial break. But when we come back, I would like to talk a bit more on the Asia-Pacific level, because this is the most, we are anticipating the most growth in this part of the world, and demand for energy is going to double up by 2030, which is not far from now. So maybe we can go on that discussion. We'll come back very shortly, so stay with us. Vantage Point, and we are on the topic of climate, energy, and also security. And if you look at security issues, the next flashpoint perhaps will not be from an act of terrorism or maybe an act of maybe military provocation, but it could possibly be a fight for resources like water, say in China and India at the Brahmaputra, for example, the water basin. So in that context, Asia Pacific is developing rapidly, resources depleting. Where do you see the possible flashpoint, next flashpoint in this part of the world, and what can we do to maybe address it before it becomes too late?
Yeah, Hezri's done excellent work on water as well as conflict in water. I'll let him handle the water aspect. For me, if I had to pick the most single dangerous thing that would cause what's called a threat multiplier, it makes all existing flashpoints worse.
Okay.
Health, disease epidemics, migration flows, biodiversity loss, all those things worse, it's climate change. Climate change is actually going to hit the Asia Pacific more than any other region. If you look at all these different assessments that say where are the damages going to go, I think 30 to 40% of the damages will go here in the Asia Pacific, even though historically we've been responsible for about 3% of the emissions. Not very fair. 3% contribution to the problem, but 40% of the impacts. And
but why is that so? Can you just elaborate a bit more?
It's mostly historically, because the US and countries in the EU have been emitting greenhouse gases pretty exhaustively for the past century, whereas these countries in the Asia Pacific have been doing it for maybe 30 to 40 years, and so they haven't caught up yet. It's the opposite looking forward. The largest future sources of emissions will be countries in the Asia Pacific, rather than countries in the EU and the US. But the historical argument is one that's nice because it talks about responsibility. Whose fault is it that we're in this mess?
So that's what's always been this international conferences on
that's right.
Who gets to pay what and who needs to cut more, right?
And that's the sticking point. The US and the EU say, you're right, we did it historically, but we're not going to do it anymore. And China, India, Malaysia say, we want to develop just like you, so we have to do it more. But it's very scary if you look at the impacts of climate change. We're going to see more things like the floods in Bangkok 2 years ago. We're going to see more wildfires. We're going to see more sea level rise, which will threaten all those beautiful hotels in Malaysia, especially those like Pulau Tiamin or in Sabah and Sarawak. They may not exist. And you think Malaysia has it bad. Countries like the Maldives may not even exist. They may be completely underwater
and then
at the end of this
the other side of the world, we have people living without water for months. So it's that extreme that's happening here. Maybe you could talk a bit about the water issue, because water is, like you said, it's going to be a huge security issue.
That's right, yeah. Without water, there won't be energy, and there won't be any food at all for us on our plate. So I think water security is the issue that's been driving the talk about security in Asia. And we are lucky because we are not part of the continental Asia, we are peninsula, so we don't feel some of these pressures that other countries in continental Asia are experiencing now. For instance, the Mekong Basin, which involve countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, now have to grapple with the issue of hydropower development up north on the Tibetan Plateau, which affect, if you dam the rivers, the big rivers, Mekong River, then the downstream states like Thailand, and where all the food production, rice production are there, it will be affected, and this will eventually impact countries like Malaysia, which are dependent on import of rice from Vietnam, for instance. So there's this connection that I think we have to really look seriously in years to come.
What you mentioned just now, this interconnections and all these things that comes together to create this big problem. Are we looking at it seriously enough at the moment? Because when you talk about water security, it's somewhere at the back of the newspaper, perhaps it's not even in a newspaper, it's something at the back of people's mind, because water, it's so accessible for us, like Malaysians especially. It's cheap, it's accessible, and it's just something that we maybe take for granted quite a bit.
Well, the issue that I've just mentioned just now may involve interstate conflict, but there are also intrastate within states, within a country. You can have, Malaysia is considered not a water-stressed country, but you're beginning to have pockets of problems, water shortages. In fact, in 1998, we experienced a water rationing in Selangor, and that caused a lot of trouble for people on the ground. And these are the kind of issues that policymakers have to look into. Of course, it's perhaps 10 or 15 years down the road, but you need proper planning to not allow this to happen in the future.
And one of the other problems is it's not just water availability, it's also water quality. Water is getting more polluted. And these things like mercury or acid rain that we do to water are very hard to undo. It costs you only about $10 to emit a ton of mercury into the air, but it costs you about $3 million to take that ton out of water once it actually enters it. And so it's not just having lots of plentiful water, but water that you can actually drink. And in places like India, they have huge arsenic contamination related to agriculture and irrigation, which means that people drink the water die from it. So you also have that level, which is, now it won't cause conflict because the people who would conflict are dead, so it's even worse and more immediate.
Okay.
We have to have a different way of looking at our water catchment, and we know where the environmental sensitive areas are. The most important issue now is how to implement, how to protect this area in a more meaningful way. And I think some of our government agencies have really spent their efforts into identifying the areas now we need to implement them. And this would require more interaction between agencies, between ministries and business sectors as well.
Like I mentioned earlier, we're just going to demand more and more. And perhaps you could also talk a bit about the energy mix. Like, what are your thoughts on maybe perhaps going nuclear, or should we be trying to work on the efficiency first before even moving to nuclear, Dr. Benjamin?
I honestly think we cannot know the answer to that question until you actually create accurate price signals and we account for the full costs and benefits of each energy system. Now this means removing subsidies. It's the elephant in the room whenever you talk about energy in Malaysia or Indonesia or practically anywhere else in the world. And we don't even know the true cost of what gas, coal, oil, wind, solar are because they've been subsidized so much. So I think the first step is let's do a true, accurate, full accounting of what each energy system costs. Nuclear will include decommissioning, waste storage, cost overruns and fueling. Wind will include decommissioning. Those turbines have to go somewhere. And then we could then prioritize based on cost, which one comes first and which one comes last.
Well, I guess we have to incorporate the notion of precautionary principle in our policy making, I think. And not knowing enough about a problem doesn't mean that we just
ignore it.
Yeah, push it under the carpet. Yeah, that's it. Yes. So I think this will have to be looked into more seriously. I think by government and also by all stakeholders, not just government but all stakeholders. I think, and this is the right time before the climate crisis become more urgent for us here.
And to tie this back to Malaysia quickly, what I've seen is if you do account for some of those subsidies, some of the cheapest sources of energy for Malaysia aren't even solar or gas or nuclear. It's things like municipal solid waste combustion, landfill gas capture, and using many of the residues from palm oil mills, like palm oil mill effluent, empty fruit bunches that you could easily convert into electricity if you wanted to. So this idea that it has to be high-tech, foreign technology is completely wrong. Malaysia could do a lot with what you've already got here.
We could probably talk about that for another half an hour in another discussion, but that's all the time that we have today. But thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin and Dr. Hezri, for coming on the show. And thank you so much for watching as well. And if you have any questions, queries, you can drop us an email or you can go to our Facebook or Twitter at Astro. I want to thank you. And we'll see you again on the next episode of Vantage Point. Goodbye. Thanks so much, Dr. Benjamin.
Thank you.